Hello there, and welcome to another weekly lesson. My name is Julia Gentry, and you know me, every week you'll find me here talking about how we bridge the gap, the one between where you are and where you want to be. And today actually is really more about me because I get to interview one of my icons. You guys, I don't get geeky about a lot of people. I don't really care. I think people are people. We all put our pants on the same way, except for this gentleman that's joining us today. He puts his pants on very differently. And he has truly actually been one of the voices in my life who has given me hope to recognize how powerful it is to lean in to hear God's voice and to follow his lead. This gentleman is also a minister who has turned into Christian media. He is a social commentator in a world that needs what he has to say so much. And today he's going to join me as we talk more about what does it look like to hear God's voice and actually to look at the equation us plus God equals our career. So ladies and gentlemen, introducing Shawn Bolz.
I do put my pants on very normal. I promise.
I knew you would like that one.
Exactly.
I do.
No,
know.
I'm so
I was
glad
like,
to be with you. It's so good.
You do. I think to me, being with you today is truly like a dream come true. I admire you for so many different reasons. I think you are a voice that our world so desperately needs, and I'm just honored to get to spend some time with you today.
Well, I'm glad to be with you and your group, your people that are a part of this. I think it's just, this is why both of us do it, is because there's people like the one who's viewing right now, you. We care about you.
We care about you. We hear you. And I think what I want to talk about with you today too, especially, I mean, your transition to me is incredible. And it documents, when it talks about us being the light to a very dark world, that I think you're doing that. I think your life is an exemplary option for people to recognize that here you were a minister, right? And having a church and now you're truly transitioning and using your career and your platform to be a beacon of light. And so I think that this is important today because obviously being in the world that we are, and the majority of people that I talk to really struggle with largely, do I hear God's voice? I don't think that I do. Right. Which then they kind of just stop there. Must be something wrong with me. Like, so it just kind of like is like well, that's just the way that it is. So do I hear God's voice? And then the second is this like gap of how me plus God equals my career, like how those things are intertwined. So can you shed some light on, Shawn, or demystify this idea that we do or don't hear God, or how we hear God, or why God doesn't talk to me, or can you give some insight on that?
It's funny because Julia, I sit down with people all the time, and I spent years doing this. We're all within 15 minutes, we'll just reverse engineer their life and see where they heard from God. The problem is most of us want direct speech. We want a voice like James Earl Jones to come into our head and say, here I am, go this way, and that's awesome. And it does happen. It's happened biblically so many times. The Bible's filled with stories of God intervening and a manifest outside of the body experience, because he is a God that somehow doesn't fit in time and space, but can come as a human being like Jesus, or he can come as the Holy Spirit. But the majority of us hear God in what I would call the 1 Corinthians 2 way, which is Paul just says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard what God has in store for those who love him, but we've perceived it by his Spirit. Now, the word perception there, and then the last verse even says, we have the mind or the perceptions of Christ. It's impressions. And we should know that more than any other generation because we're on the internet, and my computer and your computer are talking right now, and our video cameras are talking right now, and we're here because we're being uploaded and then people are downloading. So we understand a realm that's all invisible that does this, that creates media, that sends media. Well, the Holy Spirit's that realm. He's the cloud. He's like uploading or downloading the thoughts of the Father and putting them inside of us. But most of us ignore the fact that it's God because it comes across in our intuition, in our discernment. It comes across like thoughts that aren't normally mine. And all people, when they first get like really close to God, when their first season of like, whether it's called born again or getting saved, whatever you want to say, and even beforehand, people start to recognize it's God and not them because he asks them to do things, or they get a thought to do something that is kind of beyond their pay grade, or something they wouldn't want to do, like give money to this person or volunteer for this program, or you should stop doing that because that's wrong and it's stopping you from your true purpose. All of that is hearing God's voice. But what we haven't done is recognized that's part of how we are supposed to live. It's part of the lifestyle of the Word of God, the Bible, and the Spirit of God. And so when you start to talk to people and go, okay, tell me some of the most powerful decisions you've ever made, and that led to the best opportunities of your life. And then let's reverse engineer those of how you got there, because you're probably not smart enough to get yourself there. That probably was God, but you haven't quantified it yet. So by the time we do that, people start to go, oh, wait, oh, there's God. Oh, there's God. Oh, he was here. He was there. He was there when my mom was sick. He was there when I said yes to that promotion. He was there when I said no to that promotion, whatever it is. And so I think most of us we're looking for so much supernatural when God is supernaturally natural. Like he's already doing life from the inside out. And that's confusing to us. And then it becomes even more confusing because once we recognize, we go, wait, what is my desire and God's desire? Because he sounds so much like me inside the internal process 99% of the time.
I love that. I think I think you're right. I think we live in a society that wants things so fast that I want to hear God conveniently, right? And so the idea of sitting down and even reverse engineering is so interesting, because then I have to take the time and I have to consider and I have to think. And so I think that already shows us that we have to create space to be, right? I love that, be still and know, right? So there is this journey with God that most of us aren't doing. And so let's say you reverse engineer with someone, right? And then they're actually able to go, oh my gosh, God was in that, and I could hear him in that, and then I could hear them that. And like we look back and we actually see so much evidence that says God's been speaking to us and God's been talking to us, and we've even been acting on some of it. What do you think is still the cause of why do we still stalemate when in continuing that process then? Like what keeps people
I think it's because it's easy to, hindsight is 2020. So it's easy to see where God was in our life and how he led us. And Romans 8:28, how we worked something for our good that was really hard, that we know God moved us into position for, and we can recognize it. But it's hard for us to futurize and go, okay, I'm going to do some listening prayer. I'm going to stop here. And especially because so much of the way he speaks is frustrating for humanity. I mean, Jesus proved it because he spoke in parables. And the disciples even came, and I think it was Matthew 13, and go, why are you doing this? Like, what in the heck? You're speaking in symbols and signs and parables and stories. Why don't you just tell us directly what to do? I said, because, and this, I think it's Matthew 13, where he says, because if I spoke to you in direct speech, you would stare until you're blue in the face, and you wouldn't do it, because it doesn't change you. But if I speak in parables and stories, it creates receptive insight, or it causes you to be nudged from inside to change your character, to change your values, to actually learn and grow. So I think a lot of the ways that God speaks to us is really abstract, not in the sense that we can't understand it, because he speaks to all age groups and everybody can understand what he's saying. But it's not necessarily we ask a direct question, God, am I supposed to move or not? And we're waiting for that direct answer. And all of a sudden God's like, 222. And you're like, what in the heck is 222? And then you find out that 2 is a significant number in the Bible, both for the Hebrews and it's also for the Christians. It's a historic number. 222 together has shown up about 20 times in history. It starts to represent a greater transition to where you'll become one with God, that he's going to move you into something that causes your life to change. And so it's just, people are uncomfortable with the mysterious and the parabolic and the metaphorical. And yet God, who doesn't speak English, he doesn't speak Chinese, he doesn't speak Mexican or Spanish. Mexican, I love that. I have a lot of Mexican friends. He doesn't speak Spanish. We call it Spanglish. He speaks spirit, and spirit can be translated into all these languages. But if you're an interpreter, it's not easy to interpret from one language to another. And it's the same with the Spirit of God, is that he's interpreting not just direct speech and here's my commandments, because then we'll just do something for him instead of with him.
Well, and
his goal is that we'll do it with him.
Bill Johnson says, if we don't understand, if we can't understand his mysteries, we'll never understand his revelation. And how the rubber hits the road, even with that for me, is even when I wrote my book, there was this unpacking of God sharing revelations with me, because I think that had he shared revelation to me, like my internal world was not in alignment yet with the world that he was wanting me to build. And so that will send us into self-sabotage mode, right? Like it will blow our minds to the point that it will stop us. Like I think that we can hold the weight of the blessing that he wants to give us, but there's so much character development too, that I think that God is also so gracious in that he's like, I'm not going to give you the whole answer and the whole piece of this, because you can't bear the weight of the blessing. You can't even hold what you're holding now. Oh dear Lord, I'm not going to give you all of them. I'm not going to give you the whole pie. It's going to make you sick, And so I think that sometimes we think that God is withholding things from us, when in fact, like he loves us that much to be on a journey with us, right? To shape our character. So when he gives us the whole pie, that we have the character to hold it.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's so true. And I think like when you're a kid, you can't wait until you turn, 10 and you go into fifth grade because you're about to go into sixth grade. Then you can't wait for junior high, then so you can go into high school, and then you can't wait to vote. Then you can't wait, whatever it is. And
Yeah.
I think for once you're mature, you're not like you don't have these milestones in front of you. You're like, I want to be more present. I want to
Mm,
enjoy what I'm doing more. I want to enjoy my family more. I want to be more connected. And so it's different. The more mature you get, you're not looking to just achieve something and to have all these milestones. You're looking for, I want to be in the moment, in the fullness of it, and really like myself and like others in a real way and like God and like my life. So I think maturity really is more patient. It really slows us down to from where we've been at. And so I just hearing God's voice is one of those things. It's a secret sauce that'll
mm.
change everything in your life because it's continual. It's not just a one-time experience.
So talk
But
to us
it's
about this, especially because you were such a voice,
yeah.
right? You have such a huge voice currently. It's not like the gift went away, but right where when I first learned of you years and years ago, right, you were huge in the prophetic space, still are. I see that as a huge gift that God has given you to this world. And I love, and we're going to get there, ladies and gentlemen. I love that you used it in the church and now you're using it in media and you've taken it now. But coming from, especially for those of you who don't know you in your past, like you are such a prophetic voice. So can you talk to us about what is the prophetic? What is it not? Why does it creep some people out? Why do
Yeah.
we all like need to be tapping into hearing God's voice? Like, can you kind of just speak to some of that too?
Well, I feel like the spiritual gifts at large were kind of reintroduced to the church, in the 1920s in America, 1950s in America, and then the 1980s again, in some really profound movements, and not just like one place, but like multiple places at the same time, who weren't even connected to each other. 1907 to 1920, and then the gift of prophecy, and it doesn't mean that these were never around or that there wasn't groups that did it better before, but there was something like it moved forward in culture. And so in the 1980s, there was some prominent prophetic ministries that emerged specifically in America. There's some other countries as well, but you had like Chuck Pierce and Cindy Jacobs out of Colorado Springs, who's they're now in Texas. But you have Bill Hammond, Bishop Bill Hammond, has raised, I think they've trained 7 million people through their program and hearing God's voice, but also activating prophecy to actually prophesy to others. Then you have Kansas City prophets, which was like Bob Jones and Paul Cain and James Gall and John Paul Jackson, those kinds of guys, and Jill Austin and myself and others. Then you have like the Northwest prophets, like John Sanford, and it all happened around the 80s to the early 90s, where all of a sudden these guys were all just on the map and they were doing events like with the normal Christian events, all of a sudden had a prophetic voice who would come in and kind of share what's going on in the times and the seasons we're at. But it was really messy. And a lot of the people a lot of the names I didn't mention that were still part of that, there was a lot of like weird worship, almost like when rock stars first emerged, like they all of a sudden had some weird worship or some idolatry towards them, or they had ego, or they came out of real brokenness. They had terrible family stories. Like they almost all died at some point 2 or 3 times. They had just terrible stories. And some of them, the ones I mentioned, like finished well, but a lot of the ones did. I mean, there's people I knew that were in this movement. And when I say this movement, it wasn't one group. It was just a hodgepodge of people from all over morning ministries with Rick Joyner and some of the people he raised up. And so in the midst of that, I was going to the entertainment industry, and I'm not a conservative Christian, but I'm a charismatic person, and I've been around the Pentecostal movement, but I fit really well in the evangelical world too. Worked with Transformation Ministries for a long time, which is just looking for how our faith transforms culture and transforms not only ourselves but the world around us. So that's what I was focused on. But I got kind of pulled into the prophetic movement, not by a total desire, although I love hearing God's voice, but when it comes to using that as your platform for ministry, and that's all, that wasn't my thing. But I felt like God said, go this direction and be with me here. And so I went to some of the greatest churches in the world, some of the greatest Bible schools in the world, some of the greatest events that are, events in the world, and really got to grow a lot of people. And it wasn't the hill I wanted to die on, the space I wanted to be in the most. So I think that actually took the ego out of it for me, because I wasn't like, I'm here. I mean, I was 19 and speaking in front of crowds of 2,000 or 5,000 regularly. So I wasn't like, now I'm speaking in front of 20,000. I'm trying to grow in front of 50. I wasn't like trying to grow that. I just was being present because God said to go. But I learned, so funny, because that group of people, of major church leaders in the charismatic kind of Pentecostal world, trained me for how to relate to Hollywood when I came here in 2006, because Hollywood had the same kind of semi-narcissistic personalities at times, and weird and really incredible leaders who are like worthy of love, but at the same time have some weird awkward eccentricities. So it prepared me, like the prophetic movement prepared me for Hollywood. That could be like the slogan.
Yes,
And
you guys heard it there. You can put that on a mug.
exactly. It could be. And so when I came out to LA, I planted a church, and just a non-denominational church. It's still going. I gave it over to my best friends. I pastored it for 10 years, but I knew I was called to do stuff in Hollywood. From the time I was 15, I was trying to just produce and just trying to do media. And I just kept getting caught up into successful media I didn't even necessarily want, to the degree that I had a joke when I first got married to my wife. Everything that I have, God picked for me, and I wouldn't have chosen any of it except for you, to her. And she just laughed. She's like, I mean, I wouldn't have picked my friends. I love my friends. They're like the best people. I won the friendship lottery because God picked them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have picked the church television. Like I'm a TBN programmer, producer, TV host. And I also, do some stuff that, with other groups as well. And I wouldn't have picked that because I had such an offense towards, I grew up in the church in the 80s. Like we hated Christian television. It was so cheesy. We'd look at it and go, are you kidding? Like this is the best you got. People with big hair and crazy makeup and like, telephones all the time. Like I had so much judgment towards so much of the church that I now have an absolute love for, and also believe that we can reform. And so, it was really interesting. So all that to say, when I transitioned, one of the things that transitioned me was I started to have really powerful conversations. I was doing some business consulting, and I've always had a business alongside what I've done, which is I haven't talked to people to invest into it or be a part of it, but I was doing stuff in the video game world. I did alpha and beta testing for over 12 years. I had a company where there was 9 employees or 12 employees at one point. And then I also have done real estate. So like, I feel like Christians in the marketplace have been marginalized by some of the most powerful conversations we could have in the church. So I started to just interview with my co-host, Bob Hassan, just marketplace people, and say, well, how is God plus you making a difference in your world? Like as a business career person, like tell us the breakdowns and breakthrough stories. And that became like literally one of the top podcasts in the world, on the globe, not just in Christianity. And we're like, well, what happened? Why? And it's because people don't talk about that on a Sunday morning unless it's centered around kind of hooking it back into how this church built that person's platform or something. So people feel like they don't really share their stories about the marketplace, about like the venture capitalist or the farmer or the teacher or the lawyer or the doctor, which we've had all those on the show. And they share crazy stories about healings and stories, testimonies of how God spoke to them, but they really share like how their families almost broke apart. Or like I remember Michael Hyatt, one of the top business speakers in the world, he was on and he started sharing about how in the time he got his biggest check, his wife wanted to leave him. And he's like, I can't believe I'm sharing this vulnerably. Like, but God spoke to me and said, you've gone after the wrong identity here, basically. And so we've had people who come on and I feel like we Barbara Walters them a little bit sometimes. And they just share like these like really deep, vulnerable stories of breakdowns and breakthroughs. And that created a platform where I went, I need to create conversations in the church for what God can do outside of the church. And I need to help people see what's happening in culture. And that changed everything. So I say all of that because some of you are in a transition as well who are watching this with Julia. And some of you are watching Julia because she's helping you navigate things. And it's one of those spots where you can like hear wisdom and kind of get a sense of self and sense of God and what he's doing. And I think that we're in the biggest transition globally that Christians have ever been in, where God's resetting the whole sport and he's moving people out of churches, moving people out of geography, moving people out of career fields, what they're educated for. He's moving people out of one sphere of influence or one sphere of family into another. I've never seen a change like this on a global scale. And I thought right after coronavirus was crazy, but it's even crazier now in 2023 than it has been even before. So all that to say, I just wanted to add that in.
I love this. Okay, so now let's speak direct to that. I have a couple follow-up questions, but that's huge. So I know for a fact that there's probably hundreds of people who heard that and went, I'm in huge transition right now.
Yeah.
And I think transition, right? The brain doesn't actually know the difference between anxiety and excitement, come to find out, right? So,
yeah.
Right. So I think transition can bring one of the, depending on personalities, you and I are like, woohoo, like generally like our personalities are like, let's go. But there's a lot of people that are like, I don't love this. I don't like this is that. So talk to us about biblical, mental, emotional, financial opportunity. Like, what do you see? Like when you say that this is the biggest transitional time. So what does Shawn Bolz think about that?
I'll say a prophetic word, then I'll say a practical word. And
yes. Oh my gosh. I love prophetic words. Here we go.
I woke up in December and January and I can't remember exactly when it was, the day it was, but I felt like the Lord said, the enemy thinks he has the church in check, but I already have him in checkmate. And I saw all the pieces moving on a board. And I was like so excited because I didn't feel like we were God's pawns or it was like that weird thing. It just felt like you are moving your family in a position to do everything that Jesus paid a price for, to have glory break out in this generation. And then we have Asbury revival that started happening, which was an outpouring at a college with Generation Z that a lot of Christians feel is unreachable or untouchable, but they're getting like radically saved. Now it's on 60 campuses. The Jesus Revolution movie, after 50 years past Jesus, the Jesus People movement, which brought the most people to the Lord in one generation. The Jesus People Revolution movie came out and was a huge market success, and people saw it who we never thought would see it. And it created a stirring. And then you had Damar Hamlin fall down on the football field and physically die. And people ran over and began to pray from both teams. And the news anchors were praying. And he came back, and the doctor said he'll probably never play again. And if he does, it'll be years from now. And he was approved to play right after the season ended, to go back into practice. And it was a healing from God. And lots of people got saved through it. So we're watching like a resurrection on TV. We're watching in the movie theater a relaunch of what it is to be Jesus People movement. We're watching, people all over the place get like a Generation Z awakened. So people's grandkids and kids are getting awakened. They're going, oh, they are getting touched. And we're watching stuff happen on a scale that I think is accelerating. So I say that because when I look at transition's always really uncomfortable. Humans hate change. Yeah, they just do. Even you and I, as much as we love the adventure of life, if we get down to it, when it comes to, hey, you're moving again, it's not fun. Like, it's not like you go, yay, I'm moving and I have to pack everything and there's all these contracts we have to do with housing and whatever else. You go, I love the adventure with God. And when you have the goal in mind, and someone who's given birth to a baby like you, many babies, understands when you hold the baby, it's worth it. But that process sucks a lot of the time. Some women love being pregnant, but for most women, they're like, I just get this thing out of me, especially the last few weeks. And we're kind of in that last push, that last few weeks of some people's transitions where they're like, is it worth it? And we're asking those big questions. Like, is it worth being led by God and going places that I wouldn't have led myself? That's the big question, I think, of the body of Christ right now. You're asking me to go somewhere I don't want to go, or I wouldn't lead myself. Ultimately, what we're really saying is, I have to surrender to you and my will and my agenda, and believe that you have something higher, Ephesians 3:20, beyond what I could hope for or imagine. And transitions where the rubber meets the road of that. And God brings us through transition to build equity in our relationship with him and trust with him that we couldn't have gotten if we didn't say yes in those points. And Peter is a great example, because Jesus looks at Peter after, Peter fails Jesus, denies him 3 times, is out fishing on a boat, thinks he's disqualified. And Jesus goes out to him and says, Peter, do you love me? And he's like, I love you, Lord. And then after he reinstates him, Peter goes, Jesus says, this is what John's going to do. And he goes, well, what about him? What about me? What about him? And he goes, well, you're going to be led in places and ways you wouldn't go. You're going to feel blind. And he's the one God's building the church on, the rock God's building the church on. And he didn't know where he's going to go next. And I just feel like that's such a profound revelation, that we have a Father who leads us. We're Christians. So we actually have a God who leads. And that's really uncomfortable in our culture. That's saying, be the best version of you, do everything awesome. Like you're going to 10X, you're going to do all these things. And then when it comes down to it, you might do that after God strips you or changes you, or like puts you in a role that you would have never wanted to be in, because you're learning compassion, empathy with people you would have never been around. So that prepares you for the greater thing that happens, like Joseph in the dungeon prepares him for the palace. Who would have thought? That happens all the time with Christians. And so I think that's the hard part about transition, is learning yourself.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, back to the original point around, I think that the hard is harder and the transition is tougher when we don't really know that we're hearing God's voice, right? Either A, because it sounds so much like our own that we don't really trust it as him speaking to us. B, we've just completely ignored it, right? So I think, so if you could loop that around, then again, maybe you say it in the same way, maybe you don't, but here we are, major transition. There's huge, incredible opportunity for things to happen here. How do we tactically create space to hear God's voice? How do we know it's God's voice?
I love that. I think, first of all, we have to kind of build the track record of how we followed our gut, how we followed our faith, how we followed his voice in the past. And we have to use that as a barometer for what we're hearing. It's kind of like young people use a lot of times when they're learning how to hear from God. They think they've heard who they're supposed to marry at 18. And 99.9% of the time, that's hormones, not God, but it sounds just like God. It's like
hormones, not God. That's a new hashtag. That's
exactly,
hormones, not God.
Guys, that's called hormones. That's called, total flesh. But it's fun, But you look at that, you go, the picture of that is have you killed the lion and the bear yet? Because that's a Goliath. Like, you're going after Goliath. Have you ever killed a bear before? Have you heard something that's significant in your life and moved you forward that isn't one of the most consequential relationships you've ever moved into? And I think a lot of Christians, we don't build a track record. So we can't point to ourselves even when it comes to finances, like take a risk here financially. We haven't given, the $500 faithfully or the $200 faithfully to a church or a group or whatever it is. So when God's like, when we get an impression at church, give $15,000, we don't really have the history to build with that. So it's just like so much faith, but it's also anxiety because we haven't killed the lion and the bear. So I think part of it's like we have to start to track. Like Sri and I, God uses resources all through the Bible to speak to his people. So God used resources to speak to us. Now it's not the weird prosperity, false prosperity gospel. It's not, we're at a place where we're only increasing to give and only increasing to build a kingdom. But in the midst of that, like there's times we've given, there's times God's given things to us that's beyond what we could have gotten without him. And so every once in a while we'll transition he's having us make, and we have to look through the history of how God's moved in our life before. And what I'd say to your audience is that if they don't see their God history of how, not just salvation story, but can they tell that same kind of story they can tell around their salvation? Can they tell it with their finances? Can they tell it with their family? Do they have a history record? And it's not hard because you don't have to write a novel. You don't have to like write your biography, but do you write bullet points of, man, I couldn't pay rent this month. And then God showed me what kind of side hustle to do for that month. And I made an Etsy account and it worked. And I can't believe it. That was totally God. I would have been out of my apartment without that. Like those little moments, so that when it's bigger moments, when it's like, oh my gosh, this store wants my product line, but I have to manufacture. I'm cash poor right now, even though I'm successful, and I have to have $50,000 to even provide the product that they want. And because I have purchase orders, but I'm gonna have to get some help. God, how are you going to do this? But you've already seen the track record when you were in your little apartment. So when you're at the purchase orders where you need $50,000 to even fulfill them, you have faith that God's going to bring something, and you're standing on that faith. And then you're looking differently when you're prayer time. You're not just desperate, like, you're looking at it and going, hey, you've networked me to so many people I wouldn't have ever been around without you. You've put me in the audience of people who've been here before. So I'm going to ask them for wisdom. What would you do in this situation? You also dropped in divine fruit into my life from people who don't know me and aren't connected to me. You've used my family. You've whatever it is. You have that history. So the deeper we get in God and the more he's asking of us, we have to learn how to use the history. And that's what the Jewish people did. The whole Bible is a record of their history with God. So if they had something to stand on that was that no other culture has. It's unattainable for any other culture to have this kind of faith. So I feel like we have to have that personal measure of faith, and it's not hard to build. I mean, we have a thing called Spiritual Growth Academy. People go through it, subscribe to it, and they get a class every month and an event every month. One of the classes that I did was how to build your prophetic journey with God, like how to understand you hear from God, and then how to look for that. What are the signs God gives you? What are the symbols? What are the languages he talks to you through? What are the monuments in life? These kinds of things. And when I did this class, I just did it because I've done it for so many business people. It actually was one of the highest feedback we've had of anything I've ever done, because people don't usually think of that practically, but it changes everything when you do it.
Yeah. Well, and I think what also on the other side of that's always like the irony is, I say this to my kids all the time too, is obedience equals blessing. And so I think oftentimes too, it's like the thing we're wanting is on the other side of just obeying, even when it doesn't make sense. So now if you apply the look back, right, gauge the barometer, I think that's incredible. Because a lot of times we look back at our past and we only think of all the things God didn't do, all the things that we did make a mistake in, all the things at times that we didn't hear God, which fair, right? Like, but I think when you look back and you actually get a barometer of all the things God did do, all the times you did hear him, all like, right, then you go, all right, obedience equals blessing as I move forward. That like now the next step of what I'm wanting is dependent upon the step, like the step of faith. God will open the door, but I gotta knock. I have to move. I have to go. And I think that's a huge piece of that puzzle.
No, it's a great piece. And I think once you walk with God long enough and hearing his voice for your life, it's funny because then you get to these points where he doesn't speak and you're like, oh, what do I do? And it's like, you're my son, you're my daughter. Like, I trust you.
Yeah.
Make a choice from your heart, from the nature we develop together. And it's like, and it's confusing because people who don't believe God speaks, they're trying to make that choice all the time. Once you believe God speaks, you're not codependent on that voice, but you're looking at like, I want to be so led by you, God. Yeah. And then when he entrusts you to actually make choices like that, it's really profound. So it's a balance between being a son of God or daughter of God, and then also being led by God and that maturing. And so it's hard because some people are in transition right now. It's taking too long because they're not making a choice, because they're looking for a sign in the skies that's not going to come. Because God's saying, I trust you. Go after that business or go after that idea.
It's so good that you say that though. I appreciate, like, because I work in the church and the marketplace so much, I would say the marketplace is moving on their ideas, but they're missing the voice of God, right? The extra magic touch of heaven. And then the church, if they're going to hide their way, I haven't heard God. You're like, no, God wants you to also go, what do you want here? Like, to your point,
what
like,
do you want?
What do you want? And I think that oftentimes that's where we're hiding as the body of Christ of, yes, God is going to speak to us. So please, this is not saying that his voice is less important, but I think to your point, as a loving father who is like the expressiveness of God, I want to see, like, I want to write this book. I want to make this move. I think he's just waiting for us to hear what we want too.
Yeah. Well, and he's moving a lot of us into places where in certain church movements and structures, I have clout, I have credibility. When I walk into a room, I might have a handler, or like I might go to the green room, I might do whatever because of my ministry background, but I don't care because that in 2 cents gets me on the subway. That does nothing for me. Yeah. And what I want is what Jesus had, which is he had such a living relationship with the Father that anywhere he went, any environment he went into, he carried the authority, that love, to where he was relevant to that environment. And I feel like so many Christians aren't relevant outside their church environment, their structure environment. So many Christian business people aren't relevant outside of their business because they haven't learned how to give. They haven't learned how to take their social capital and not try and monetize all the time, but actually network for the sake of the kingdom being built.
So talk about this in our last 5 minutes. Let's talk. We're just going to throw some bombs. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Like you made that comment, you plus God equals your career. And what if you and God, can you talk about that? Like, what is the opportunity there? How do we need to be thinking about our career and God and the prophetic? And can you put a beautiful red bow?
Yeah, I think it's great. I'll try and put a bow on it by saying God, before you were born, Ephesians 2 verse 10 says that he made you for a destiny and a purpose. And so we get to be with God, and that's one purpose, but we also got to do things even into eternity that will be so fulfilling to us. So that's why when you get into the thing that you're made for, the types of roles that you're made for, there is a flow state, just like artists talk about, that you get into where that's why workaholics love workaholism, because they get into that flow state. They just love the building, the process. Video gamers get into it because they want to level up. Business people get into it because they want to see more built. They want to see more happen. They want to see more finances flow. And we're supposed to celebrate that. We're supposed to glory in that, not to the degree that we have unhealthy boundaries, not to the degree that that becomes our identity. But many people go through the first part of identifying what they're called to, do a measure of it, and then stay there for 30 years and end up doing a lot of things that they're not called to because they don't know when it's time to transition. I see senior pastors all the time who should probably not be senior pastors anymore, but they didn't jump and transition when God was having them. So now they're a retired old man or woman who's not super happy because they didn't actually, they don't really have a lot. I've seen lots of business people who stayed in a franchise when they should have sold that franchise a long time ago and use the lessons they learned from that franchise to build their own business outside of a franchise, or to do a different type of franchise that was more relevant, that they could have taken that. And I feel like people are really good at the beginning of business coaching and self-help, but they're not good at actually going on the further journey, which is you actually want a God result in my life. You're going to take me from one place of, wow, this is good, to another place. It's called from glory to glory, to another place that's better. And I'm made for greater works that I can't produce in my own education, my own socioeconomic background, my own sphere of relationships. I cannot produce the fruit that you're going to produce for me. And so I can't settle. We're never called to be settlers in our career or in our industry. And we're not called to just have a 30-year career and then retire. That's not God's idea for Christians. Christians, we always, till the day we die, we're going to be doing something with God. Otherwise, we gave up at some point. We sat down at some point and God never asked us to. Maybe culture did. Maybe the American dream was that, but that's not what God asked us to do. So when you think of that, there's a blessing in that God, through Ephesians says you were made for something in destiny that he prepared and dreamed of before you were born. That means that there's so much hand detail and resourcing for that vision, that dream. And so as you start to discover it and you go, wow, this is what I'm wired for, you become a version of yourself that you can't be unless you do it. And some people touch on it, like musicians who aren't even saved, all that you can hear it in their voice. They're like, they get in that place. It's the gifts of God are without, he doesn't ever revoke them or return them just because you were born with it. It's in you. But man, when you do it with God, in partnership through the Holy Spirit, it's like that flow state that you can't feel in anything else. You can't feel by just being in a worship song. You have to live a life of worship by doing what God's called you to do. And worship songs are beautiful and I love them, but it's like, there's something about doing what you're called to do that you'll have unlimited energy. It feels like you'll feel like you'll run and not grow weary, but most people are weary because they're running in the wrong lane.
Yeah, so good. So one person that's in there today going, oh, I don't feel worship. My career doesn't feel like worship. I'm just doing my job, right? You could give them one piece of advice to move in that direction.
Yeah.
You did.
I would
You
say
did.
maybe it's not your career. Maybe your career, your 40 hours a week is going to prepare for the other 40 hours a week of free time that you have. And not everyone has free time because they have families, but maybe you're supposed to do a mission alongside your career. That's your destiny. And that you got to look for that. Like maybe it's like anti-human trafficking, or maybe it's a bit of side hustle business, or maybe it's taking care of poor. What it could be a justice issue, or it could be a missional issue, it could be a church thing. But you don't have to look at your career. Maybe you have to provide for people, and you're in a season of being a mom or a dad or whatever. And so don't look at your career as limiting your destiny. Your career sometimes is your destiny. Other times it's just something you do to serve the greater calling in your life. And I think that toilless workload that some of us get into, we allow ourselves to then rest on weekends in a way that doesn't really give us rest by just like laying around and watching TV or games or whatever. And it doesn't really give us rest. It just gives us a place of reprieve. Excuse me. What gives you real rest is when you actually do what you're called to do. And it doesn't mean that you're exhausting yourself all the time or running on all cylinders. I can do some of the things I'm called to do, like when I'm writing sometimes, it's deeper than if I took a Sunday afternoon nap. I just get more rest from it. And it's not because I'm trying to write my next book. It's because there's something inside of me that's flowing that I don't have access to except for in those moments. And it, again, flow state. It's spirit to spirit. So I think people need to find that outside of just sometimes even in normal roles. And maybe you go, well, I'm working a job 40 hours a week. I can't do it. Well, you better put boundaries around that 40 hours a week. Unless you're a business owner and sometimes you have to push for a season and that can't be a forever, you better start putting boundaries around it so you can do what you're called to.
Yeah, it's so good. That's one thing in closing I say to people all the time. They're like, I'm just tired. I'm like, you're not tired, you're bored. You're bored because you're not accessing that flow state, right? You're not.
Or disconnected is a good word too.
Spirit.
Disconnected
100%,
from.
100%.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, if you could shake everybody right now with one final message, right? With where we are in the world and maybe a little stagnant or whatever it is, if we could shake someone right now, what would you say to them?
You do hear God. You do, I promise. It's he made you for it. I think if you're stuck, there's no one who's going to want you to be unstuck as much as you're supposed to want you to be unstuck. But God in heaven wants you to be unstuck. So if you're stuck, you have all kinds of resources. Like right now, you could think of like the top 5 people. If you could just meet with them and have a conversation with them, how powerful would it be? Maybe for you, it's Oprah or Bill Gates. Just kidding. But I love Oprah and Bill Gates. I just said that was a joke. But maybe it's someone like a pastor. Maybe it's like Pastor Bill Johnson, Joel Osteen, Joyce Meyer, whoever, TJG&x. Maybe it's a pastor. Maybe it's somebody who's a life coach, business coach, but you have Jesus inside of you. And he is more connected than any of them to his full purpose because he is God. And so I think we have to take God, our relationship with God, very, very seriously, that he lives inside of us. And if there's a disconnect from you from that, that creates that stuckness. But as soon as you reconnect to the fact that God is going to bring all the resources and the input and the wisdom I need. James 1, ask for wisdom, it comes generously. That will heal your disconnect. No one will want you to be more connected than God wants you to be. And no one's supposed to want it more than you're supposed to want it. And so that's, to me, what I want to shake people with. You hear God.
You heard it. You heard it from Shawn Bolz himself. You hear God. I love it. Okay. And if people want to hear more from you, tell us more about your academy and more about your podcast, or where we can dive in.
So Shawn Bolz Show is on YouTube and pray.com. And then we have Exploring the Marketplace, which is on Charisma Podcast Network. The easiest way to find everything is the Bolz app, BOLZ app. And it has all of our latest videos and podcasts, and that kind of thing. The only thing it doesn't have is I'm on TBN all the time. So TBN, if you go to tbn.org, you can watch me on TBN or watch it in your local channel listings. And so you can see me, I'm all around. But Shawn Bolz Show is a great place to start and just find out about my perspective and what I believe and how it can help you. So
good. Shawn Bolz, you're still one of my favorite people. And ladies and gentlemen, he still does put his pants on differently, but that's fine. We'll argue about that later. Thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in to another weekly lesson. We hope that you are encouraged and reminded as we shake you that you do hear God, that heaven is celebrating the voice that you do hear of God working in and through you, and that we cannot wait to see what you're going to do in the world around you. Until next week.